Have a balance of 55 minutes. I'll assume you were moving this motion yesterday. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. I continue in moving the bill on the Employment Amendment Bill number 2022 on the right to disconnect, Mr. Speaker. As you are aware, I said yesterday in the opening remarks, this bill on the right to disconnect generated a lot of issues across the country, where people are saying that this bill will promote kupiga sherehe because your employer will not call you, will not call the employee, Mr. Speaker, sir. And you know, Mr. Speaker, sir, in the onset of, Mr. Speaker, in the onset of COVID and lockdown, we started working remotely from home. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, there was a lot of challenges, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to how do you regulate. There is change in the traditional environment, Mr. Speaker, when you look under Section 27 on hours of work. Mr. Speaker, as per the standard practice, hours of work in Kenya is between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. in the evening, Mr. Speaker. So the right to disconnect bill is in recognition of the ever-changing work environment where many people, Mr. Speaker, are working from home. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, there is a lot of misinformation about this bill, that the employer cannot call an employee after work, working remotely from. How will you regulate, Mr. Speaker? How will you regulate, Mr. Speaker, on the hours? How do you ensure that somebody who is in the office, Mr. Speaker? So this bill of right to disconnect, there is a standard of engagement. Mr. Speaker, naturally, you would be paid overtime. You would be paid for extra working hours. Mr. Speaker, this bill of right to disconnect, Mr. Speaker, is to protect Mr. Speaker, the workers from burnout, Mr. Speaker, from fatigue. The employers who are notorious, Mr. Speaker, when at around 4:45, they give you an assignment and say by tomorrow 8 a.m. in the morning, in the first briefing meeting, the report should be ready. Mr. Speaker, we are threatening the right to privacy. We are threatening, Mr. Speaker, the right to family, Mr. Speaker, which is very important because family time, right to privacy, Mr. Speaker, is important. Mr. Speaker, this right to disconnect, for example, is many people have been given opportunity, Mr. Speaker, and the right to disconnect. Developed countries like France in 2016, Mr. Speaker, passed the law. Belgium has done, and where we have 65,000 on the public sector, Mr. Speaker. France passed in January, Belgium, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker. Portugal passed the right to disconnect. US is in the consideration. In 2012, Volkswagen Company Limited gave powers where it was being blocked from getting emails beyond 5 p.m., Madam Speaker. And because this was to protect from burnout and overwork, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, sorry, I've noted the change on the seat. Therefore, even, Madam Speaker, in January 2021, the European Union, came up with the right to disconnect as a worker's right to be able, Mr. Speaker, and this is the definition that right to disconnect has been given, Madam Speaker. The EU have defined right to disconnect to mean right to disconnect, a worker's right to be able to disengage. Right, Madam Speaker, to disconnect, a worker's right to be able to disengage from work and refrain from engaging in work-related electronic. That's about full of definition, Madam Speaker, and therefore, to refrain from engaging in work-related electronic communications, e.g. emails, other SMSs during non-working hours. So that is how right to disconnect has been defined. And I want Kenyans to understand there must be a proper way of doing these things. And therefore, in my opening remarks, Madam Speaker, it is important. I wanted to open the remarks of this the right of employees to have their personal time and privacy respected and for connected purposes. So that when you go after 5, Madam Speaker, there is an argument in the country, Madam Speaker, where people are asking, for example, how can we implement this law? I've seen even Federation of Kenya Employers raising questions on how you can comply with it. I've seen, what I'm just doing, Madam Speaker, is just migrating the workspace to in line with the remote working from home. Madam Speaker, when you look at Article 41 on labor relations, it talks about every person has the right to fair labor practices. Every worker has the right to reasonable working conditions. Madam Speaker, therefore, it's a labor right. Even under the Employment Act, we must provide a reasonable working environment, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, even if you look at the Section 31, Employment Act, it's about housing, Madam Speaker. And in that housing, you have seen a situation where the issue of a housing levy ban is becoming a serious issue. In fact, Kenyans did not know the provision of Section 31, where, Madam Speaker, I can just read for the benefit of colleagues, is Section 31. An employer shall at all times, at his own expense, provide reasonable housing accommodation for each of his employees, either at or near to the place of employment. This is the finance bill on talking about housing levy fund, Madam Speaker. Now Kenyans are realizing that that you must provide for your employees a housing. You know, people used to imagine that the obligation, and the Employment Act is very, so what I'm just increasing is enriching reasonable working conditions. So that one, to protect employees. Madam Speaker, you are the floor of the House, and I heard your serious contribution on mental health of police officers. Most of our employees in Kenya and workers are suffering from mental burnout, mental illness, because of the pressure from work. People are suffering from diabetes, pressure, heart-related diseases because of the pressure of targets. But Speaker, in fact, private like banks, you must target. People are given, you must target. I'm not saying, sorry, Madam Speaker, I'm not saying that people should not sign performance contract. They should. Because there are targets. They are being told, if you don't achieve this, you are fired. Madam Speaker, it destabilizes even the mind of that employee. And you find employees feel now disengaged from their family. And you know the basic unit of any society is having a strong family. That is the strength of a nation. If you don't have a strong family, you must be there for your children. You must be there for your spouses, Madam Speaker, so that they also grow, so that we don't raise a generation where they don't respect authority or accountability or transparency, Madam Speaker. And therefore, this right to disconnect, and it is good, the People's Watchman is on the floor, and I'm giving him an addition to now to properly litigate, because if we pass this law, you shall not have an employer calling you beyond your leave days, your off days, you are beyond working hours. Because, Madam Speaker, we will be abusing that right that has been provided for. And therefore, Senator Okiya Omtata, as the People's Watchman and one of the serious litigators on the human rights that we have in the Republic, Madam Speaker, will have opportunity to also look at the law and be able to write. Madam Speaker, many people would argue this is the first law in Africa. Many people would say, why would we need to disengage? I've given enough reasons as to why. Right to privacy, avoid burnout, protect mental wellness of the employees, ensure fair work, fair remuneration. Equal work equal to equal pay. And therefore, Madam Speaker, it is very important. Where, you know, I'm told in some organizations that some of the managers give work to their employees immediately before 5, which is unfortunate and which is unfair, Madam Speaker. I know there could be office wars and office. I know some managers are malicious. Maybe they want to hold down, especially the interns. and of course with their other intentions that are not known. But the point is that this, so that it is a warning. I'm not saying, because I've seen Federation of Kenya Employers, Central Trade Union, we are saying if you have to call me as your worker, there must be some sort of arrangement. There must be sort of engagement so that you pay overtime. If I leave office at 5 and you give me a work that I should complete by tomorrow morning, then I should be paid for that period. So we pay for overtime, we pay for the beyond the normal salary, Madam Speaker. And therefore, I'm looking at Amending Employment Act, that is introducing Section 27A or Clause 27A. An employee has a right to disconnect from the employer. An employer, for the purposes of this section, put in place policy regarding the circumstances under which an employer may contact an employee during out of work hours. So it is not a blanket statement. Circumstances under which an employer may contact an employee during out of work hours. So it is there, Roman 2, use of electronic devices to send or receive information, messages, or any digital work-related communication during out of work hours. Number 3, circumstances under which the right to disconnect may be waived. So it is very important. For example, somebody can ask, what about security agencies? What about essential services? This has been provided for. There is an engagement, like on-call doctors and many others. Madam Speaker, Part B, specify the nature of compensation for employees who work during out of work hours. Just that overtime, payment of overtime, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, where an employer has employed more than 10 employees, such employer shall, in formulating a policy under subsection 2, consult the respective employees or, where applicable, trade union. So I don't know why COTU, Central Organization of Trade Union, was worried. I don't know why people were worried, Madam Speaker. Yet this is a very straightforward matter that talks about anything with the union will look at it. The right to disconnect shall be subject to the terms and conditions specified under Section 10. The right to disconnect shall be limited only to the extent necessary to address the emergency arising out of work falling within the responsibility of the employee. Madam Speaker, if you are a doctor or a nurse working, for example, at KU, not KU KNH here, and you are needed as on emergency, if you are a police officer, if you are anybody working under emergency, Madam Speaker, it is important that the right to disconnect shall be to the extent necessary to address the emergency. Outside the emergency, you must be paid overtime. You must be paid for working extra hours. Because, Madam Speaker, and I was asking Federation of Kenya Employers that, Madam Speaker, you must also have a serious, what do we call, also productive workforce. And I don't think having workers beyond 5 in the evening, concentration is there, sugar levels are there, they are tired. Madam Speaker, I don't think it would be fair at that point, Madam Speaker. And therefore, when you look at this, is that I'm telling the Federation of Kenya Employers and COTU and other trade unions, the reason the law was given 8 to 5 p.m., 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. as working time, and I think 56 hours or 52 hours within a week, that every should work, is to also, that employee of yours to rest. Madam Speaker, you have seen even UHC, they were disengaged the other day on 19 May, Madam Speaker, on 19 May. The contract of UHC, who have been contracted under COVID program, came to an end, Madam Speaker. And therefore, we are talking about the work, improving working environment. And I think that is what is important, Madam Speaker. And therefore, there is a lot of victimization. So when the question that Kenyans ask, Madam Speaker, if your boss calls you and you don't reply, so what happens? And you don't work in an emergency program, you don't work in an emergency program, you don't also, how can I put it? You don't work as an emergency. There is no engagement, Madam Speaker, of payment or ensuring in any way, Madam Speaker, if your boss calls you under this law and you don't receive, unapiga sherehe mahali. You are on a weekend, you are unwinding, you are enjoying yourself, Madam Speaker, you are somewhere in Watamu or Ukunda or somewhere in Mutembei or somewhere in Busia or somewhere in Nandi. There is a place called Stephen Kositan Gardens, and you are unwinding, and your boss calls you. If you don't receive now, Madam Speaker, you might end being disciplined. Or being, and I know of a famous CEO who used to call his employees beyond evenings, during weekends, people on leave, people on annual leave, maternity, paternity leave. You can imagine, instead of having a paternity or maternity, taking care of your child, somebody somewhere is calling you, and if you don't reply, you risk developing. So, subsection 6, an employee shall not be reprimanded, punished, or subject to disciplinary action if the employee disregards a work-related communication during out-of-work hours. So, therefore, even here in Parliament, your staff, Madam Speaker, you don't get called beyond their working hours. They have a right to refuse to pick. And if they don't pick that phone call, Madam Speaker, they should not be reprimanded for disciplinary action or, Madam Speaker, or even, I know the culprits are normally even in media. I have friends who are journalists. A fire breaks out in Kikomba, and you are working for certain media houses. I don't want to name names, risk. Somebody might think we are taking it out of the privilege here. And you are being called, can you go and cover Kikomba, and it is 2 a.m. in the morning. Madam Speaker, you are sleeping. You are performing godly duty at night, because the assignments that should be done at night, as God directed all of us in the Holy Book of Genesis. You are resting. Maybe even you are unwell, and your boss calls you, go and cover. And I think journalists suffer the brunt. Journalistic profession, whether they want to, for police and other, it's an emergency situation, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, and in a couple of minutes I will wind up. Then Senator Okiya Omtatah will second, because he has a vast of knowledge on such issues, Madam Speaker. So in this, where an employer contacts an employee during the period there is no mutually agreed out of work hours. So, Madam Speaker, if there is no agreement that your employer should call you beyond 5 or beyond work hours, because I know there are Kenyans who use night shift. So if you are working in night shift between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., as your boss, I'm not allowed to call you unless there is mutually working environment. And that one means I must compensate you as an employer. So many Kenyans were asking, what happens now? If my boss calls me and I'm enjoying, Madam Speaker, tomorrow is a public holiday. Some people have started winding down or winding up for the week, for the holiday. If, for example, they have left office like 42 minutes, what happens? So unless there is a mutual agreement of work, and that is why, for example, our staff here, traditionally, our working hours at Parliament are not the 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. There is a way we work. So this is mutual agreement. So I don't expect an avalanche of litigation simply because you are working in a night shift, and therefore, since they have said they should not call you beyond 5, that is misinterpretation of the law. There must be a proper arrangement. Then there must be an issue of compensation. Madam Speaker, where an employer contacts an employee during the period where there is no mutually out of work hours, the employee shall not be obliged to respond and shall have the right to disconnect. I'm not saying when you see your boss's phone call, you switch off your phone or throw it away. Madam Speaker, I'm saying when you are called and there is no arrangement, you have a right to disconnect. Even the email you block, WhatsApp you block, there is SMS you block. I'm not encouraging employees in this country to block their bosses after 5. There is that feature where you can block. It's called supplementary services or divert. But people, you don't need to divert to somebody else. You know that people are very malicious. They can divert you to other areas, to even now the famous, is it 199 or 999, the police diversion. So, Madam Speaker, you have a right. Number 2, may choose to respond for which an employee shall be entitled to court compensation. So if your boss calls you and you receive, you must be compensated. So if I'm calling you at 5:42 as your boss, and I give you an assignment that it should be complete tomorrow, those overtime working hours must be compensated. And I think that's the law. So may you choose to disconnect, or you receive the assignment and then demand for compensation as per this law. Mr. Speaker, the provision of this section shall not apply to the provision of essential services, so it will work together under Section 81 of the Labor Relations Act. Mr. Speaker, a person who contravenes this section, this is my final part of presentation, is if you contravene, so if your boss calls and insists on you receiving, or you contravene this Section 27A that we are introducing above work hours, is that 1, not exceeding 500,000 shillings, or imprisonment of term not exceeding 1 year or both. So the right to disconnect, if your right as an employee is violated, the legal recourse, the legal remedy is you must pay that employee a compensation of 500,000, or 1 year as an employer, or both. But as Speaker, I think these are straightforward, because if you keep calling your employees, harassing them, giving them work, you are not compensating them, you are threatening their right to privacy. You are threatening their family time. You are threatening the burnout, the mental wellness, Madam Speaker, the energy. You know, you need people. I know of employees, Madam Speaker, when they leave office at 5, they go to the gym to get to become what you call summer bunnies. You know, in the US, especially this season, I think, what we call this season that has come at the end of winter, people are trying to get what we call in street language summer bodies, or what we call summer bunnies. I'm told they travel to Kenya during a cold season. And I'm told men are malicious when their wives or girlfriends get summer bodies. They say, "Uyu tutaeka mimba." So, Madam Speaker, what we are just saying in summary is the punishment is 500,000 or 1 year or both. And therefore, the Employers Federation of Kenya Employers, the